Good evening, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. We're thrilled you came out on this chilly night. My name's Lisa McCubbin, and I had the great honor and pleasure and privilege of working with Mr. Clint Hill on this book. It's our second project together. Last year we did Mrs. Kennedy and Me, and it was largely because of the overwhelming response we got to that book that we decided to do another one at the urging of our brilliant editor, Mitchell Ivers, who's here today from Simon & Schuster. And this was really kind of his idea to put together the story of those 5 days in November from Clint's viewpoint, which is so personal, and he tells the story like no one else can. And so we're going to share with you tonight a taste of the book and hopefully bring it to life for you like you've never seen before. So Clint, you started in the Secret Service. President Eisenhower was president. And then in 1960, John F. Kennedy was elected president. And one thing a lot of people don't realize is when administrations change, they bring in all of their own people. The one thing that stays the same is the Secret Service. So you assumed you were going to be transferred to President Kennedy's detail, but you found out that you were being assigned to Mrs. Kennedy. And what did you think about that?
I was very disappointed. Felt like somebody had demoted me to the second team because all the action in the past had always been with the president, and that's where I wanted to be. I knew how they treated agents with first ladies previously. They watched fashion shows and tea parties and canasta games. That's about all they did, so I didn't want any part of that. But I had to accept the assignment, and I did.
And when you met Mrs. Kennedy, she was very pregnant, and about 2 weeks into the assignment, you got a phone call.
Yes, it was Thanksgiving night, 1960, and I got a phone call. I was at my home, and the phone call told me that they had just taken Mrs. Kennedy to Georgetown Hospital. In an emergency situation, she was about to give birth. So I raced to Georgetown Hospital, paced the floor like an expectant father. The president was in Florida, and I was there and witnessed when John F. Kennedy Jr. was born, and I saw him shortly after birth.
And in the photo there, you can sort of see Clint peering behind. And in a lot of these photos, you have to sort of pick him out because he tries to stay in the shadows. His job is to not be in the photos, but you'll see him as we go along. So even though you were with Mrs. Kennedy, you spent a lot of time with President Kennedy as well, just because you were so close to the family.
Yes, I had a great deal to do with President Kennedy. In this particular photo, we were in Florida, and I had been advised that the President's brother-in-law, Prince Radziwill, and his best friend, Chuck Spaulding, were going on a little walk. And periodically, the President and Mrs. Kennedy were going out to check on him. And they knew that the Secret Service was going to have to go out there or be there, so they volunteered me.
And how long was this little walk?
50 miles. And so I put on my only shoes I had that would last that long. They were wingtip dress Florsheim's. And I picked up the Prince and Mr. Spaulding, and we went out to the Sunshine Parkway and started walking toward Fort Lauderdale.
And so what's this a photo that we see here?
The President came out. The Prince and Chuck are resting. The President is admonishing me because I allowed them to rest. You see, there was a little wager involved. He bet them they couldn't do it, and he wanted to make sure I pushed them hard enough so they couldn't.
And so you were with them all the time. You were with them when they went to church. There you are next to President Kennedy coming out of church. And when Mrs. Kennedy traveled, she did a lot of traveling overseas, often by herself without the president or just with her sister. And Clint, you were with her. What was it like traveling with her and protecting her?
Well, the biggest problem was crowd control because she was an extremely attractive lady. Everybody wanted to be as close to her as possible. This is a photo in Ravello, Italy, coming out of Mass. You can see the crowd there that has been generated to see her, and that was a typical situation. Whether we were in Italy, whether we were in India, Pakistan, Morocco, France, Greece, or Italy, it didn't matter. It was always the same.
And so tell us a little bit about the size of the Secret Service detail at that time.
Well, back in 1960, there were only 2 of us assigned to Mrs. Kennedy. 3 were assigned to the children. and 34 were assigned to the President. That meant that at any one time there were only 5 agents with the President, because it was shift work, 3 shifts a day, plus agents were out on advance assignments. Some people were on leave.
Okay, so let's go through we're going to show you some photos of the kind of challenges the Secret Service faced when they were protecting this wildly popular couple around the world.
This is in Dublin, Ireland. You'll see the crowds can't be contained on the sidewalks, with too many of them there. Into the streets, they had a hard time getting through the crowd. They're hanging out of windows, on top of balconies, and on rooftops, any place they could be to get a better view of the President. This is in Costa Rica. The military is trying to help us get through the crowd. They're having a difficult time. You can pick out the President there. He's in a black suit amongst the crowd right here. So that's very difficult. This is in Mexico City. Now, Mexico City is quite high in elevation, but that's not snow. That's confetti. There was so much confetti that by the time we got to the end of the motorcade, the car was full right at the top of the back seat. This is in Billings, Montana. Somebody had decided to pass their young child across the top of the crowd so that they could touch the President, something we tried to avoid, but very dangerous, but it happened all the time. This is in Berlin, Germany. 2 young women have broken through the outer perimeter and approaching the car, tried to shake the President's hand. They're about to be pushed back into the crowd. This is the Ich bin ein Berliner speech site in Berlin. There were hundreds of thousands of people there. They were on top of buildings, on rooftops, on balconies, and windows, every place they could be in order to see the President.
And 5 Secret Service agents to protect the President in this kind of environment. So we go into 1963. There was a trip planned into Texas. It was meant to be 2 days, 5 cities. How did this trip all come about, Clint, and why did they go to Texas?
Well, it was actually 3 days. We were going to go to San Antonio, Houston, Fort Worth, Dallas, and then Austin, and then out to the LBJ Ranch. The trip was planned in the spring of 1963 in a meeting down in El Paso, Texas, between President Kennedy, Vice President Johnson, and Governor Connally. In 1960, the election was very, very close. So they knew that in 1964, they had to carry some states in the South. So they picked 2 with the most electoral votes, Florida and Texas, and decided they would campaign in those 2 states. On November 16th, President Kennedy went to Florida. Then he went to Cape Canaveral, Palm Beach, Tampa, and Miami. Then he came back to Washington. Then they planned to leave on Thursday, November 21, for Texas. Mrs. Kennedy was going to go along.
And so that's the reason you went on this trip, is because Mrs. Kennedy was on the trip.
Correct.
So take us through that first morning as you're at the White House. How does the day begin?
Well, the President had an early morning appointment there with 2 ambassadors from the United States to a couple of countries in Africa. That was the only appointment he had before we were going to leave. When he came down from the 2nd floor residence, he passed by my offices, stuck his head in and said, "Clint," he said, "we're going to take John with us on the helicopter out to Andrews." I said, "Yes, Mr. President, I'll have the agents alerted." And so that's what we did. We flew out of the White House in a helicopter and flew to Andrews Air Force Base. Mrs. Kennedy, the President, young John were on board. We got to Andrews, and they were about to get off the helicopter and go to board Air Force One, and young John wanted to go along. Well, he couldn't go, so he had to go back to the White House, and he got very upset, and he started to cry. So President and Mrs. Kennedy trying to console him, they told him that, "Look, John, we'll be back to celebrate your birthday next Monday, November 25th. That didn't seem to satisfy him. So the President turned to Agent Foster, who was with him, and said, "Mr. Foster, will you take care of John while I'm gone?" And Mr. Foster said, "Yes, Mr. President." And so that was the last thing that we heard the President say to in John's presence, that he would be back and that he wanted Agent Foster to look after him until he got back. Then the President boarded Air Force One, and we flew on down to San Antonio, Texas. We arrived down there. There was a large crowd at the airport. Thousands of people had lined the airport, including on top of the terminal, inside the glass terminal. They were everywhere they could be in order to see the President and Mrs. Kennedy. Fortunately, on this particular occasion, the President avoided going into the crowd. He got right into the car, and we began a motorcade from San Antonio International Airport out to the new Aeromedical Space Center Medical Laboratory.
And so the president's in an open-top car. The weather is great, and everything is going wonderful. What are we seeing in this photograph?
A very typical situation. The president decided to stop the motorcades to allow people to come and shake his hand. He asked us to do that periodically as we were traveling down the street, and that's what you see here. The crowd is trying to rush to the presidential vehicle. Then we went down on through downtown San Antonio, and here you see the people on the street and on balconies and hanging out of windows everywhere they could be to see the President and Mrs. Kennedy. We get to an airport again out at Kelly Field in order to leave the area, and another large crowd with help from some of the military MPs.
And then you fly to Houston.
We arrived in Houston International Airport, another immense crowd there. All these crowds were very large, very exuberant, but they were all very, very friendly. The atmosphere was very friendly as we traveled through San Antonio into Houston. We went from Houston downtown to the Rice Hotel.
But this photograph, we see them going into the crowd here, which they didn't do in San Antonio, right?
No, because of the way the crowd was contained in San Antonio, the president couldn't get at them. In this case, they were too close, and so he had the opportunity to approach the crowd, and that's what he liked to do. He liked to get into a crowd, shake hands, and have some one-on-one with individuals within that crowd. They went into the Rice Hotel, and there was a meeting of the LULAC group, which was a Spanish-speaking group, and the President Mrs. Kennedy went there, and he had Mrs. Kennedy talk to them, and she spoke to them in Spanish. And he was extremely happy with this because he could see the reaction among the people. They were very happy that they were there and that she had spoke to them in their native language. We then went on over to the Coliseum. They had a testimonial dinner for Congressman Albert Thomas, who had brought the Space Center to Houston. The people were very excited about that. Then we motorcaded out to Air Force One, got back on board, and flew over to Carswell Air Force Base near Fort Worth, Texas, arriving there around 11:05 at night. It was raining. There were thousands of people there, families with children, and I couldn't understand that. 11:05 at night, raining with children. I got pretty jaded, apparently, because I was always around the president, but then I realized this was their once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to see a president, and they took advantage of it. The crowd at the hotel when we got into downtown Fort Worth was so large we had a tough time getting through the crowd to get into the hotel. We took them up to the 8th floor and put them in the suite that they were to occupy that night.
So all of that happened the first day, November 21st. The reception in Texas was so enthusiastic, everybody was so exuberant, and from a political standpoint, they were thrilled.
The politicians had underestimated the reaction they were going to receive, and they were very, very pleased with how everything had happened. And so were President and Mrs. Kennedy. When we put them in the suite that night, they were very pleased with everything that had gone on that day.
And they fully expected the next day was going to be just as wonderful. Friday, November 22nd, 1963. You found out something was going on in Dallas. You were going to be flying from Fort Worth to Dallas that morning.
We woke up in Fort Worth. It was raining, but we woke up with knowledge that a leaflet had been passed around to people over in Dallas, and it said, "Wanted for treason," with a photograph of the president. There also was a large article in the local newspaper in Dallas criticizing the president on all the policy decisions he had made. It was very anti-Kennedy. And so the president made a comment to Mrs. Kennedy that morning. He said, "I want you to know one thing. We're headed into nut country today." And so he was fully aware of the problems that existed in Dallas.
But the Secret Service, did you have any specific threats in Dallas? Were there any threats against his life?
We had no threat information whatsoever regarding our trip to Dallas. The only thing we did know was that a month earlier, UN Ambassador Adlai Stevenson had gone to Dallas to make a speech. During the speech, he was heckled, he was spat upon, they hit him with a placard. So we knew that the area was filled with people who didn't agree with the policies of the administration, but we didn't believe that anyone would be foolish enough to try and be that close to the president. And thus far, we were looking forward to this trip into Dallas because we thought it would be similar to the experiences we'd had the previous day.
So in Fort Worth, you wake up in the morning, and outside of the hotel, before dawn, people have already started to gather. It's drizzling lightly. You see here in this photograph, again, people have brought their young children out in the rain before dawn. What was this all about?
This is an unscheduled stop, but they had to add this particular speech site to the itinerary because there was a breakfast being held inside the hotel we stayed in, but it only could hold 2,500 people, and there were thousands of people that wanted to see him, so they set up another speech site out in the parking lot so that people could be there and he could address them. It was raining. The president came out, didn't wear a raincoat, he just came out in his suit. Everybody else had their rain gear on, and he spoke to the crowd. There were thousands of people there. You'll notice that the windows on those buildings are open. People are hanging out, and on rooftops as well. And the president spoke to all these people that were there for a while, and then he went right into the crowd to shake hands, which was very typical of the way he liked to operate.
And you can see some of the agents around. There's just, again, a handful of agents that are there to guard him, all very close to him in this situation.
We always relied on the local authorities for most of our support, and they always did a wonderful job. So then the president went into the hotel to speak to a 2,500 people packed breakfast program. He walked in there and he went to the head table, sat down. I had gone over to the presidential suite on the 8th floor from my room, which was right next to the president's room, to be with Mrs. Kennedy, because she had indicated to me on her schedule that she was not going to go to this breakfast. Her schedule said on the very bottom, JBK won't attend. So we anticipated that she would go directly from the hotel to the airport. However, the president noticed that everybody was clamoring to see Mrs. Kennedy. So when he got down to the breakfast, he called the advance agent over and said, "Call Clint, tell him to bring Mrs. Kennedy down right now." So I got a phone call in the presidential suite telling me that the president wanted Mrs. Kennedy down there. I tried to explain to the agent that that wasn't on her itinerary. He said, "You don't seem to understand. The president said, bring Mrs. Kennedy down to the breakfast." I said, "I understand. I hope she will." And I explained it to her, and we came down to the breakfast. She was a little askew, but she made it down there to the breakfast.
So there you are, leading her into this breakfast. You don't look so happy in this photo.
No, I wasn't very pleased.
So then everybody was thrilled that Mrs. Kennedy came to the breakfast. She got a standing ovation. All the ladies had come to see her especially, and everything went very smoothly. And then from there, you're heading back to the airport because now you're going to fly to Dallas, and this was the scene.
Yes, we left the hotel by motorcade to go out to Carswell Air Force Base. There were thousands of people that lined the streets as we left. They had dismissed school. They had high school bands at almost every intersection. It was a glorious day for the people there in Fort Worth to see the president, and President and Mrs. Kennedy were very pleased with the reception that they had received.
So you're going to take Air Force One from Fort Worth to Dallas. Now, it's a very short distance. It doesn't seem to make sense at all. Why did you fly from Fort Worth to Dallas instead of driving?
Well, it wouldn't make any sense to most people because of the distance. So it wouldn't be much quicker to drive. But this was a political situation, and they wanted a photograph of President and Mrs. Kennedy coming off the rear of Air Force One in Dallas. And so that's what they got. And here they are going to come down the rear ramp, going to be met by a large reception committee, including Vice President and Mrs. Johnson, who they had just seen 10 minutes before over in Fort Worth. But that was politics. And so there was a large crowd gathered behind a fence line. The president noticed them and immediately went to that crowd to shake hands. Mrs. Kennedy normally wouldn't do that. She joined him and went to the crowd as well. They shook hands as they walked down the line. The photographers were having a field day. They were climbing on everything they could get up on in order to get a good photo. They loved when this happened. And the announcers in the radio stations and TV stations were going crazy with what was going on here, the president being received so well by the people of Dallas. So we got in the motorcade and we started into downtown Dallas. The crowds they built largely from very few to very many as we proceeded into the city. You'll notice that there are some points where it was difficult to get through the crowd. The driver of the presidential vehicle was keeping the car farther to the left-hand side of the street because the president was in the right rear and he was trying to keep him away from the crowd. But Mrs. Kennedy was in the left rear and that put her right up next to the crowd. So occasionally I would get up in the back of the car to be as close proximity to her as I could be to prevent anything from happening. Now, we had been told the president didn't want us in the back of the car. That had happened the previous weekend in Tampa. But I knew what my job was, so I did get up in the back of the car. I'd answer to him later if he had any questions.
And that looks a little bit precarious and uncomfortable. What was it like jumping off the follow-up car and getting onto the back of the president's car?
Well, the most difficult thing is jumping off at a speed, hitting a fixed platform, the street. When you're already moving at a certain speed, you have to have your body going about the same speed the car was in order to make it work. But there was a little platform on the back of the bumper there. You'll see I have my feet on it, and there's a handhold on top of the trunk. So that was the position I was in. We traveled down the street, and the crowds got bigger and bigger, right into the street. They were on balconies, on fire escapes, hanging out of windows, every place they could find a spot. There you see I am up on the back of the car. You'll see how close we are to the left-hand side as opposed to the right-hand side of the street. And that was the way we traveled down Main Street in Dallas. This shot is toward the end of Main Street as we traveled down that area. It also is the cover photo of our book. And here we go. We had to turn right on Houston when we got to the end of Main Street, and then take a left on Elm Street.
And at this point, you can see the crowds have really dissipated. So this is sort of the end of the motorcade. Most of the crowds were on Main Street, and you're heading into an area called Dealey Plaza.
Yes, we were coming down Main Street, and we turned right on Houston and had to make a very sharp turn on left turn on Elm, right in front of the Texas School Book Depository. Now, a lot of people say, well, why didn't you go straight down Main Street? Well, we couldn't because we had to go right when we got underneath the triple underpass in order to get on the Simmons Freeway. If we had gone straight down Main Street, we couldn't get across that concrete divider that was in the center of the road. So we had to go right on Houston, left on Elm, to make it work, getting to the Simmons Freeway on our way to the trademark.
So this is a photo of you on Elm Street. You've turned onto Elm Street, and explain where you are, who these people were seeing in this photo.
This is called the follow-up car. It's the car immediately behind the presidential vehicle. I'm in the forward position. Here, this is Agent McIntyre. Agent Reedy's on the other side opposite me, and Agent Landis, my assistant, was opposite Agent McIntyre. There was one other agent in the back of the car. He had an AR-15 rifle. He was in a position between two of President's aides, Kenny O'Donnell and Dave Powers. And there was another agent in the back from the Intelligence Division making sure everything was going okay. The car was driven by an agent, and there was an agent in the right front seat. As we proceeded down Elm Street, we were down there about 120 feet. We had slowed down considerably because of the sharp turn. But as we got down to about 120 feet, I was scanning the area to the left and straight ahead, and all of a sudden, I heard this explosive noise over my right shoulder. It came from the rear. So immediately my eyes went from the scanning position to the left all the way to the right toward the noise, toward the explosion, but I only got as far as the president's car. And I saw what happened in the back seat. All of a sudden, the president made a motion with his hands up against his throat, and he moved violently to his left. I knew something was wrong. Something had happened. I jumped from my position and ran toward the presidential vehicle with the intent to get on top of the rear of the president's car to form a shield or barrier to protect President and Mrs. Kennedy from anything else happening. When I jumped off the car, I had to get between a motorcycle officer and the follow-up car. The motorcycle was making a lot of noise. Later, they told me there was a second shot when I was in that position. I didn't even hear it because of the noise. But as I approached the presidential vehicle, just as I was approaching it, there was a third shot. The president's head was down to his left, and he was leaning over toward Mrs. Kennedy because he had a back brace on, and he couldn't bend forward, and he couldn't go to the right because of the side of the car. So he had to go to his left with his head down. When the shot rang out, it hit the president in the rear of the head here, and it exited out the right rear quadrant of the skull. It was very explosive. Material just erupted from that wound. There was brain matter and blood and bone fragments that came out of that over the trunk, over me, over Mrs. Kennedy. When that happened, Mrs. Kennedy came up on the trunk of the car. She was trying to retrieve some of that material that came out of the president's head, trying to gather it together. She didn't know I was there. I got a hold of her, and I put her into the back seat. When I did that, the president's body fell farther to its left. His head ended up in her lap. The right side of his face was up. I could see that his eyes were fixed. There was a hole through the skull. I could see in it. There was no brain matter left in that general area. I assumed it was a fatal wound. I turned. I gave a thumbs down to the other agents to make sure they knew how serious it was, screamed at the driver to get us to a hospital, and he accelerated immediately, and we raced up and down Stemmons Freeway, led by the chief of police from Dallas, Chief Curry. We went to speeds up to around 80 miles an hour. I was wedged in, and you'll see that shortly.
Now, it took Clint longer, way longer, to tell you what happened than the amount of time that this all developed. It was just a matter of seconds. And you have to remember, when that first shot rings out, your brain has to process what to do. And so the timer stops when that first shot happens. We're going to show you the Zapruder film now. It's been edited slightly. The fatal headshot has been cut out. And the reason we do that is because Abraham Zapruder, who took the film, was so horrified when he took this film, and he thought no one should ever see that. And so we don't show that, but this is to show you how quickly things developed.
We came down Houston and turned left onto Elm. We were led by some motorcycles. You see the presidential car coming here. As he gets about this point, he's hit for the first time. He trades his hands up, and then the fatal shot, and I climb up on the back of the car. I wedged myself up there and got as high as I could. We were traveling at excessive rates of speed. I turned my head and my sunglasses blew off. At one point, Mrs. Connolly, who was seated right in front of Mrs. Kennedy, moved, and I could see that the governor was covered in blood, so I knew he had also been shot. But that was the first time I knew that. And we raced to Parkland Hospital. This scene is after we had arrived. When we arrived there was nobody there. We arrived, and we had to move the governor out of the car before we could do anything as a president because of the way the car was configured. He was sitting in a jump seat right in front of the president. We finally got him up on a gurney. They rushed him into the emergency room and put him in trauma room 2. Then we were going to help the president. But Mrs. Kennedy had a hold of him, and she wouldn't let go. I pleaded with her. I said, please, Mrs. Kennedy, let us help the president. No response. I did it again. Still no response. Now, I'd been with her for a little over 3 years, so I knew pretty much how she thought things about. And I realized that the problem was she didn't want anybody to see the condition he was in, because it was horrible. And so I took off my suit coat. I covered up his head and his upper back. As soon as I did that, she let go, and we put him on the gurney and erased him into the trauma room 2 in the emergency room. Hundreds of doctors were in the hospital at the time, and many of them reacted and came immediately to the emergency room, trying to do everything they could to resuscitate the president.
And so you're inside, outside. The press has gathered. Most of the press was in a vehicle, several cars behind. They knew something had gone terribly wrong. They're trying to gather information. Meanwhile, you're inside. You're told, or you decided that you needed to contact the White House immediately and let them know what's happening. What was that phone call like?
Well, I opened the line to the White House in Washington to tell my supervisors what exactly the situation was. And I was in the process of talking to them when the telephone operator cut in. He said, Mr. Hill, the Attorney General wants to talk to you. I said, fine. So the Attorney General was Robert Kennedy, the president's brother. So he said, Clint, he said, what's going on down there? I told him about what had happened, tried to explain that both the president and the governor had been shot and were in the emergency room at Parkland Hospital, that the doctors were working on them. And he said, well, how bad is it? Well, I didn't want to tell him that his brother was dead. So I simply said, it's as bad as it can get. And when I said that, all I heard was the click of the phone as he hung up, and he found out in that way that his brother had been killed.
Meanwhile, many of you might have been at home, and this is probably how you heard the news.
Here is a bulletin from CBS News. In Dallas, Texas, 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade in downtown Dallas. The first reports say that President Kennedy has been seriously wounded by this shooting. More details just arrived. President Kennedy shot today just as his motorcade left downtown Dallas. Mrs. Kennedy jumped up and grabbed Mr. Kennedy. She called, "Oh no," the motorcade sped on. The United Press says that the wounds for President Kennedy perhaps could be fatal. Repeating, President Kennedy has been shot by a would-be assassin in Dallas, Texas. Stay tuned to CBS News for further details. This is Walter Braun, guide in our newsroom, and there has been an attempt, as perhaps you know now, on the life of President Kennedy. He was wounded in an automobile driving from Dallas Airport into downtown Dallas, along with Governor Connolly of Texas. They've been taken to Parkland Hospital there, where their condition is as yet unknown. We have not been told their condition at Dallas. In a downtown hotel room, a group had been gathered to hear President Kennedy when he was waiting his arrival. Let's switch down there now, where Eddie Barker of KRLD is on the air.
As you can imagine, there are many stories that are coming in now as to the actual condition of the president. One is that he is dead. This cannot be confirmed. Another is that Governor Connolly is in the operating room. This we have not confirmed.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago.
50 years later, it's still just as moving as when you first heard the news. Now, Clint, you're inside. You don't know what's being broadcast. You're dealing with the chaos there at Parkland Hospital.
Yes, they were doing everything they could to try to resuscitate him, but at 1 o'clock, the doctor came out and said, we can't do anything more. The president is dead. And so when that happened, the president's closest aide, Kenny O'Donnell, came to me and said, Clint, we need a casket to transport the president's body back to Washington. I said, fine, I'll see what I can do. I arranged through the administrator of the hospital to contact the O'Neill Funeral Home in Dallas and ordered the best casket they had to be delivered to the emergency room for the president. It was delivered. The nurses began to prepare the body to be placed into the casket. Then we found out that the people in Texas decided that we needed to have an autopsy there in Dallas before we could leave. You have to understand that at that time, 1963, it was not a federal crime to kill the president. It was a state crime. And so the state law in Texas prevailed. And so they told us that they would have to do the autopsy there. We asked them how long it would take. They said hours, maybe a day. We said that's not acceptable. We need to take the president back to the nation's capital. We can have the autopsy done there. They said, well, that's in violation of state law. There was some additional discussion between my supervisor, the president's chief aide, and members of the authorities there in Dallas. And we finally said, well, we're leaving anyway. And they said, well, if you're going to do that, please have a medical professional remain with the president through the entire process. I volunteered Admiral George Berkeley to do that. He was the president's physician, and he was with us. And so they placed the president's body in the casket. We brought the casket out to the hearse. Admiral Berkeley got in the rear of the hearse with the casket. I brought up Mrs. Kennedy, and said, we could ride in this car right back here. And she said, no, I'm going to ride in the hearse with the president. And so I said, okay. So I opened the door and put her in the back of the hearse. And I climbed in behind her. So there we were on the way to Love Field in the hearse, the casket in the back of the hearse with Admiral Berkeley, Mrs. Kennedy, and me. And that's the way we went to Love Field in Dallas.
So then you get to Love Field, and now the agents have the horrible, unbelievable task of having to carry the casket of the president who they were supposed to protect up to Air Force One.
The Air Force One crew had removed a bunch of the seats in the back of the aircraft so that we could place the casket there. We started to carry the casket up the rear stairway. It was extremely heavy and very difficult. We got up to the top of the steps and were about to go through the door. We found out that the casket with the handles on it was too wide, so we broke the handles off. We put it in the rear of the aircraft and set it on the floor. Mrs. Kennedy then came on board and sat next to the casket with Larry O'Brien, Kenny O'Donnell, and Dave Powers, and we had one agent stay there with her. I moved to the forward portion of the aircraft to do some other tasks.
And so then Vice President Johnson needed to be sworn in on the ground there. He found a federal judge, but before the swearing in, Mrs. Kennedy wanted to tell you something.
Before the swearing-in ceremony began, I got word that Mrs. Kennedy wanted to see me. So I went back through the presidential suite to where she was seated. She stood up, she grabbed my hand, she said, "Oh, Mr. Hill, what's going to happen to you now?" She was very concerned about how I was reacting to what had happened. She knew that the administration was now changed from the Kennedy administration to the Johnson administration, and she was very concerned about where my next assignment would be. I was just shocked that she would think about that at that time, because I knew she was going to have to stand beside the Vice President in just a few moments for this photograph. She was still covered in blood. She hadn't done a thing to change that, and so I went back to my position in the front part of the plane, right behind the doorway there, standing there as she stood beside Vice President Johnson as he was sworn in as the next President of the United States.
And then you were with them on Air Force One on that long, somber ride back to Andrews Air Force Base. Again, you and the other agents helped unload the casket and take it to Bethesda Hospital.
Yes, we took it out to Bethesda Naval Hospital, took him there because he was a former naval officer, and they decided that's where the autopsy would be performed. The autopsy lasted most of the night, and then about 2 o'clock in the morning, I got a telephone call. I was up on the 17th floor with Mrs. Kennedy. We had placed her in a suite up there so that friends and family could be with her while we waited for the autopsy to be completed. They called me and asked me to come down to the autopsy room. They wanted me to observe the President's body just before they finished, so that if the questions were ever asked by Mrs. Kennedy, I would be able to answer them as to the exact condition the body was in at the time that the President was placed in the casket.
So then it was about 4:30 in the morning when finally you were able to go back to the White House.
We got back to the White House about 4:30, as you say. We were met by a military group to escort us to the North Portico. Then the military carried the President's body into the East Room, placed it on a catapult in that room, identical to the one that was used for Abraham Lincoln in 1865. Mrs. Kennedy and members of the family who were there came in and stood as the honor guards were posted around the presidential casket.
So then what time did you finally get to go home?
Well, she remained here a few minutes and then went upstairs to the second floor residence. I went downstairs to my office, which is on the ground floor, and I stayed there until about 6 o'clock to make sure she had no other needs. And then I went to my home, shaved, showered, got a little bit of something to eat and changed clothes, and came back to work.
Because now at this time, all of the other agents have transferred to President Johnson. Remember, there are 2 agents with Mrs. Kennedy. There's nobody there to replace them. There's no other shift. So Clint and his associate, Paul Landis, went home, as he said, shaved, showered, came back. They had to be with Mrs. Kennedy. So what happened that day, Saturday?
Saturday, the 23rd, there was a private mass in the East Room for the family. Then Mrs. Kennedy called me and said that she wanted to go to Arlington National Cemetery. She and the President's brother, Robert Kennedy, and two of his sisters, Pat Kennedy Lawford and Jean Kennedy Smith, were going to go with Mrs. Kennedy to pick out the burial site. And so I took them to Arlington National Cemetery, met there by Secretary McNamara, and they picked out the gravesite for President Kennedy.
And at this point, basically, the world has stopped. Stores were closed. People were sent home. Children were sent home. People were watching television. For the first time ever, television news was broadcasting 24 hours constantly without commercials. It had never been done before. Everybody was just in shock, and this resonated around the world. This is a vigil in Berlin because this president had touched people around the world. Sunday, November 24th, 1963.
That morning, there was going to be another mass, private mass, in the East Room. And then we were going to take the body up to the U.S. Capitol, to where he would lie in state in the rotunda. I'd gone over to my supervisor's office, and I was sitting there talking to him. Phone rang. I was told that the General McHugh, the president's assistant, wanted to talk to me. So I picked up the phone. He said, "Clint," he said, "you better come over to the main residence right away because Mrs. Kennedy wants to see the president." I said, "Okay, I'll be right there." So I ran over to the East Room where she was. She was standing in the doorway with Robert Kennedy. I said, "What do you want to do, Mrs. Kennedy?" And she said, "Robert Kennedy and I want to view the president's body." I said, "Okay, just a moment." So General McHugh and I went in. We made sure that everything was okay. We opened the casket and got it ready, and then brought in Mrs. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy to view the president's body. They stood there for a few, maybe a minute, and she turned to me and she said, "Mr. Hill, would you get me a pair of scissors, please?" I said, "Yes, ma'am." So I ran back to the usher's office and got a pair of scissors, brought them in, gave it to her, stood there. I could hear the clip, 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 and I knew what she was doing. Robert Kennedy and Mrs. Kennedy then backed away from the casket. They turned and started to walk toward the elevator to take them to the second floor. She handed me the scissors, and they went up to the second floor. I returned the scissors to the usher's office, and I noticed that there was some particles of hair still left on the scissors.
So now they're going to take the president's body by motorcade on a caisson to the Capitol. And as we showed you in the photographs before all of this happened, and in Texas, there was always crowds lining the route. There were people screaming and hollering and shouting. When we were working on this book, one of the most painful things Clint said, as he remembers from this time, was that procession to the Capitol. There were no screams, no shouts, no cheers. There was only this sound.
We got into the rotunda. Mrs. Kennedy, Carolina, and John were there. At one point, John got a little rambunctious, and so we had to take him off to another room away from where the crowd was. And then Mrs. Kennedy and Carolina approached the casket, walked over and knelt, and kissed the flag that draped the casket. They got up, and we left the rotunda. As we walked outside, we noticed that there were hundreds of thousands of people who had gathered they wanted to view the president's casket. And so this went on for the rest of that day, all night. They finally had to turn them off at 9 in the morning because we were going to move the president's body back to have the funeral service, but there were still thousands of people lined up who wanted to view the president's casket.
So on Monday, November 25th, 1963, 50 years ago today.
It was 50 years ago today, and it was John F. Kennedy Jr.'s 3rd birthday. But it was also his father's funeral. And so we went to the Capitol. The body was placed on the caisson and brought back to the White House. We went there by automobile and back. And we got back to the White House, and we were met by hundreds of heads of state who had come to Washington to pay their respects, including President de Gaulle from France, Emperor Haile Selassie from Ethiopia, the President of Ireland, the President of Germany, the President of Italy, the Queen from Greece, the King Baudouin of Belgium. They were all there to pay their respects. Mrs. Kennedy made a desire known, and that was that she wanted to walk on part of this procession, and so talked her into just walking from the White House to St. Matthews. And so here you see she's walking with her 2 brothers-in-law, Robert Kennedy and Teddy Kennedy. I'm on the left in this photograph. Beside me is Jamie Auchincloss, Mrs. Kennedy's half-brother, step-brother, rather. Then Sergeant Schreiber, then Steve Smith, and then hidden behind Teddy Kennedy is Agent Paul Landis. In the back, you'll see President Johnson and Mrs. Johnson, their 2 daughters, Lucy and Linda. Those are all agents surrounding them, walking on the way to St. Matthew's Cathedral.
So you walked, and it was about 1.25 miles. Imagine all these heads of state out in the open. The president has just been shot, and this is just a security nightmare, if you can possibly imagine.
It was that.
The funeral was held then in St. Matthew's, and when you came out, John gave this infamous salute. Tell us about this. You were there witnessing this.
Yes, we came out, placed the body on the caisson in front of St. Matthew's, and the military rendered the salute to the president. Mrs. Kennedy saw this, and she bent over and whispered something into John's ear, and John turned, threw his shoulders back, and saluted his father. Now, that wasn't a natural thing for young John. In very early November, Mrs. Kennedy came to me and said, Mr. Hill, the president's going to go to Arlington National Cemetery on November 11th. While he's there, we know that the military are going to salute him as president. I would like John to go along, and I'd like to have him be able to salute his father as well. Do you think the agents could teach him how to salute? I said, sure, Mr. Kennedy, that's no problem. We'll do that. So the agents started to work with John, trying to get him to salute. Trouble was, he'd only do it with his left hand. And that went on for a long time. Finally, on November 11th, when he went to Arlington with his father, he did it properly. And everybody was so relieved and pleased, couldn't believe he finally got the message. Well, on this day, on November 25th, during the services, John got a little rambunctious again, and Mrs. Kennedy turned and asked that one of the agents come and take him to another room, and they did. So they're trying to keep him busy while they were in there, so they thought they'd have him practice his salute. So they were working with him, and he was saluting, but the trouble was he's right back to using his left hand. He just would not use his right hand. There was a Marine colonel standing in the doorway, and he saw this. And he walked into the room, he stood at attention, he saluted properly, and he said, John, this is how you do it. And I'll be damned. It took that colonel 15 seconds to show John, and he did it properly. We've been working with him for weeks to nothing. So it just shows you, sometimes those Marine colonels know what they're doing. We then traveled from Arlington to Arlington National Cemetery from St. Matthew's. But before that, 2 of the people who were there at the funeral and paying their respects were former Presidents Truman and Eisenhower. Truman with his daughter Margaret, and former President Eisenhower with his wife Mamie. Then we went to Arlington National Cemetery, crossing Memorial Bridge near the Lincoln Memorial, to thousands of people. They had lined the streets all the way from Arlington National Cemetery back to the U.S. Capitol. There were hundreds of thousands of people who came to Washington for this funeral. We got to the cemetery, and here you see President de Gaulle saluting, along with Emperor Haile Selassie and the various heads of state there. The flag was then folded. It was presented to Mrs. Kennedy. We then went back to the White House, where Mrs. Kennedy held a reception for all those heads of state that had come to see her and pay their respects to the President. Meanwhile, I told Mrs. Kennedy, I hope you remember that today is John's 3rd birthday, and she did, and they had a little birthday party after this reception upstairs in the White House. It was just John, Caroline, and their cousins and members of the family, but it was something that they had promised John when they left that previous Thursday. They told him, we'll be back Monday to celebrate your birthday, and she did. That night, it was after 11 o'clock, phone rang, and it was Mrs. Kennedy. She said, Mr. Hill, the Attorney General and I want to go back to the cemetery to pay our respects and to see the eternal flame. I said, okay, we're standing by, we're ready to go. And so she and the Attorney General came down, and we took them to Arlington. She brought a small bouquet of flowers with her. They knelt at the grave and prayed for a few minutes. We stayed there over 10, 12 minutes or so, and then went back to the White House. But that was the end of November 25th, the 5th day in 5 days in November.
And Clint, I know that for many, many years you couldn't even bear to talk about this with anyone. And it's been emotional. It was very emotional writing this book. But I think for a lot of people it's healing. It's been a sense of closure to know what really happened that day, to know the truth. And we are so thankful that you shared your story. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. If any of you have any questions, feel free to ask a question. Please raise your hand. Yes, go ahead.
Do you think back race on President Kennedy, do you think that he would have lived if he didn't have that?
Repeat the question.
Do I think that the fact that he was wearing a back brace, if he had not been wearing it, would he have lived? I don't know. There's no way to tell that. But it would have given him a chance to duck anyway. But the back brace prevented him from moving forward, and so the only way he could go when he moved was to his left.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Hill, I always wondered why you were the only agent that reacted. I mean, they may have been occupied looking other ways, but in seeing you respond, I'm just curious why no one else took your lead.
The question is, why was Mr. Hill the only agent that reacted?
One of the photographs shows that, pretty much. When the first shot was fired and rang out and we realized what it was, I turned toward that noise, and I saw what happened in the backseat of the car. The agent behind me, his vision of the President's car was obscured by my body. The two agents on the other side of the car also turned toward the noise, which meant they turned away from the President's car. By the time they turned back, I was already at the presidential car, and there was nothing more that they could do.
Yes, sir.
Rumor has it the night before the majority of the agents, some agents were out drinking.
The night before? Well, I'll tell you exactly what happened the night before. I'll tell you this. We left Washington that morning on November 21st, and we flew to San Antonio and were served a nice light lunch by Air Force One on the way to San Antonio. Then we flew to Houston, then we flew to Fort Worth, and we didn't eat or do anything before we got to Fort Worth. We got to Fort Worth, we put President and Mrs. Kennedy in their suite, and I went off the floor around 1 o'clock, and I was hungry as hell, and I was tired. But I hadn't eaten anything since noon. So I went down in the lobby, and there were other agents with me, and Merriman Smith, who was the head of the White House press corps, was there, and he said, if you guys want to get something to eat, why don't you come with us? We're going over to the press club. So we went over to the press club. press club where there was supposed to be food. There wasn't any food. They'd eaten it all up. So I had a drink myself when I was over there. And then they said there was a place down the street where they might have something to eat. We walked down there. They didn't have any food either. And so then I went back to my room. Went to bed, placed a call to wake me up at 6 o'clock, ordered breakfast to be served in my room, which consisted of eggs, bacon, potatoes, orange juice, toast, and coffee, if you wanted to know. And that's the only nourishment I had that whole night. There was no carousing. There was no partying. There were some guys like myself who were damn hungry.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Hill, once more, it's a privilege and a pleasure listening to your recollections, especially have you seen that Oliver Stone movie JFK? What's your reaction to that 20 years later? That's also celebrating an anniversary. And Stone still admits that there was a triangle, a crossfire going on. What do you think?
The question is about the Oliver Stone film JFK.
That movie has caused more problems than anything I can remember because it is so full of just baloney. There are so many things in it that are just not true. And he really knows that. I happen to know one of the consultants that were working on the film. He happened to be a detective. And he went to Stone during the process of shooting that film and said, look, the things that you're putting in this movie aren't true. Stone said, I know that, but this is a movie. It doesn't matter. I'm making a movie. I'm not doing a documentary. And so he didn't care. And it was just full of erroneous information. And it's unfortunate because most of the young people that saw that movie at that time believed that that was true. And it was not. Now, there have been other movies that come out that are almost as bad, if not worse, in some respects. Very few are actually factual.
Anybody over here? Yes, sir.
Well, thank you again. Wanted to ask this. At Parkland Hospital, with all the chaos, where was Mrs. Kennedy while the president was being operated, and also where was the vice president?
In Parkland Hospital, where was Mrs. Kennedy and what was happening and where was the vice president?
They'd taken the vice president into another section of the hospital and sealed that off. Not too far from the emergency room, so we knew where he was and we could get information to him. Mrs. Kennedy and Mrs. Connolly were in the area between trauma room 1 and trauma room 2. But Mrs. Kennedy periodically would go into trauma room 1 to be there to observe what was going on. But they were both seated out there. There was a small walkway between the two rooms, and they were both right in that vicinity.
And Agent Landis was always with Mrs. Kennedy while Clint was on the phone. Somebody was always with her. Yes.
50 years ago today was the funeral and the party for John. It's 7 p.m. now. Where were you 50 years ago today at 7 p.m.?
7 p.m. 50 years ago today, I was in the White House, in my office on the ground floor, waiting to see if whatever Mrs. Kennedy needed, standing by.
The birthday party was over?
Birthday party was going on, and it was on the second floor, and we allowed that to be very private and family only. And that's the way they wanted it. Did you have another question?
First of all, I want to thank you for your service.
Thank you.
You're an American hero as far as I'm concerned. My question is about, maybe you've heard about George Hickey, a fellow agent. Can you speak a little about that and maybe his inadvertent shot of Kennedy?
The question is about Agent George Hickey. There's been a television program on and a book written claiming that George Hickey, who was manning the AR-15 rifle in the follow-up car, that he accidentally shot the president, and that's what killed the president. And for some reason, a lot of people are believing this.
George Hickey, way back years ago when he was still alive, and this story came out in a book, he sued the publisher. The publisher didn't want to go to court because they found out we had photographic proof that Hickey couldn't have done it. And so they settled with Hickey out of court. Now Hickey is dead. there's nobody left to sue them. And so they sold this thing to a production company, and some detective down in Australia put in his 2 cents, and they've resurrected that theory. It didn't happen. The gun, actually, that he was holding was examined after the motorcade. It had never been fired. Hickey was seated or standing between 2 particular individuals, Dave Powers, President Kennedy's probably closest associate, personally, and Kenny O'Donnell, his chief of staff. If Hickey had done what they've alleged, I can guarantee you those 2 Irishmen would have killed him.
Let's take one more question. Yes, sir.
Knowing you stayed with Jackie a little bit after the events in November, what was the last time that you had interaction with Mrs. Kennedy, and what were your feelings when you learned of her passing, and then, of course, of John Jr.'s passing?
The question is, when was the last time you saw Mrs. Kennedy, and what were your feelings when she passed and when John Jr. passed?
I saw her, the last time was in June of 1968 at Robert Kennedy's funeral. I was at that time the agent in charge of presidential protection, and I brought President Johnson to the funeral. And I saw her and I spoke to her very briefly, but that was the last time I saw her, and she got married that fall, as you know. Now, what was the other part of the question?
And what were your feelings when she passed away?
When she passed away in May of 1994, it just so happened that day I had an appointment with President Clinton. He had asked me to come. He wanted to talk to me in the Oval Office. And so I went there, and then that evening after I went home, I found out that her condition had worsened. We discussed, he and I, about how sick she was, and that night I found out that she had died. I was very, very sad. I had really wanted to talk to her again, but I also knew that if she heard my voice, it was going to be a memory of what had happened back in Dallas, and I didn't think that was really the thing to do. Young John, when he was killed in that plane crash, it was a real shock and terrible, because I was there with him when he was born, and now to know he had died in that manner, it was just terrible. So he would have been 53 years old today.
And okay, there are 2 more questions. All right, yes. Yeah.
To say that when you embarked on writing Kennedy, we approached the Kennedys to ask if they were finally doing the book. And Caroline said, my mother was always fond of Mr. Hill. I'm sure anything he writes about would be fine with her. So
did everybody hear that?
reading the book, she gave permission. That's how much they trusted her.
Yes,
this is our publisher, Louise Burke. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, that's true.
A nice testament.
Caroline finally said that Mrs. Kennedy saw a lot of me, and whatever I wanted to do, that was fine. She didn't have any problem with it.
All right, last question, ma'am. You're asking about the writing process and how difficult it was? When he goes through well, it was very difficult. We had an office. We had 2 computers side by side. We spent almost 24 hours a day together for many months, and I didn't live through this time, so all of this is his memories. We would there's a lot of video footage, as we showed you tonight, and so we would watch those videos together. And it was very emotional, and he would tell me what happened, and certain things would bring back memories to him. And there were times, you know, we had to stop, because I could see how difficult it was for him to relive all of this. And at one point, I said, okay, this is the last book. We're not going to make you go through this again. So let's just get everything out there in this one, because it really was painful. Do you want to say anything about that, Clint?
It was very emotional. Writing of the book themselves, though, getting that material out, talking to Lisa, and really unloading that emotional baggage I had held within myself for so long was very beneficial to me. It was cathartic. I really am glad that I've done it because I'm much better now than I was. We started the process. I could barely talk about it without breaking down because it was so painful. And many of the agents were the same way. We had never talked about the assassination among ourselves as agents. We had never talked about it with family members. We had never talked about it with anybody. I testified to the Warren Commission, and I had one interview on 60 Minutes, but other than that, we had never talked about the assassination at all.
Are you the only one alive from the chase car, sir?
I'm the only one alive that was on the presidential vehicle. There are 3 other agents, former agents alive, who were on the follow-up car.
So I think we should get to the book signing now. And thank you all for coming, for your patience. Thank you.
We'd like to.
You were with them when they went to church. There you are next to President Kennedy coming out of church. And when Mrs. Kennedy traveled, she did a lot of traveling overseas, often by herself without the president or just with her sister. And Clint, you were with her. What was it like traveling with her and protecting her?
Well, the biggest problem was crowd control because she was an extremely attractive lady. Everybody wanted to be as close to her as possible. This is a photo in Ravello, Italy, coming out of Mass. You can see the crowd there that has been generated to see her, and that was a typical situation. Whether we were in Italy, whether we were in India, Pakistan, Morocco, France, Greece, or Italy, it didn't matter. It was always the same.
And so tell us a little bit about the size of the Secret Service detail at that time.
Well, back in 1960, there were only 2 of us assigned to Mrs. Kennedy. 3 were assigned to the children, and 34 were assigned to the president. That meant that at any one time, there were only 5 agents with the president because it was shift work, 3 shifts a day, plus agents were out on advance assignments. Some people were on leave.
Okay. So let's go through we're going to show you some photos of the kind of challenges the Secret Service faced when they were protecting this wildly popular couple around the world.
This is in Dublin, Ireland. You'll see the crowds can't be contained on the sidewalks with too many of them there. Into the streets, they had a hard time getting through the crowd. They're hanging out of windows, on top of balconies, and on rooftops. Any place they could be to get a better view of the president. This is in Costa Rica. The military is trying to help us get through the crowd. They're having a difficult time. You can pick out the president there. He's in a black suit amongst the crowd right here. So that's very difficult. This is in Mexico City. Now, Mexico City is quite high in elevation.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. We're thrilled you came out on this chilly night. My name's Lisa McCubbin, and I had the great honor and pleasure and privilege of working with Mr. Clint Hill on this book. It's our 2nd project together. Last year we did Mrs. Kennedy and Me. And it was largely because of the overwhelming response we got to that book that we decided to do another one at the urging of our brilliant editor, Mitchell Ivers, who's here today from Simon & Schuster. And this was really kind of his idea to put together the story of those 5 days in November from Clint's viewpoint, which is so personal, and he tells the story like no one else can. And so we're going to share with you tonight a taste of the book and hopefully bring it to life for you like you've never seen before. So Clint, you started in the Secret Service. President Eisenhower was president. And then in 1960, John F. Kennedy was elected president. And one thing a lot of people don't realize is when administrations change, they bring in all of their own people. The one thing that stays the same is the Secret Service. So you assumed you were going to be transferred to President Kennedy's detail, but you found out that you were being assigned to Mrs. Kennedy. And what did you think about that?
I was very disappointed. Felt like somebody had demoted me to the 2nd team because all the action in the past had always been with the president, and that's where I wanted to be. I knew how they treated agents with first ladies previously. They watched fashion shows and tea parties and canasta games. That's about all they did, so I didn't want any part of that. But I had to accept the assignment, and I did.
And when you met Mrs. Kennedy...
But that's not snow, that's confetti. There was so much confetti that by the time we got to the end of the motorcade, the car was full right up the top of the back seat. This is in Billings, Montana. Somebody had decided to pass their young child across the top of the crowd so that they could touch the president, something we tried to avoid, but very dangerous, but it happened all the time. This is in Berlin, Germany. Two young women have broken through the outer perimeter and approaching the car tried to shake the president's hand. They're about to be pushed back into the crowd. This is the Ich bin ein Berliner speech site in Berlin. There were hundreds of thousands of people there. They were on top of buildings, on rooftops, on balconies and windows, every place they could be in order to see the president.
And 5 Secret Service agents to protect the president in this kind of environment. So we go into 1963. There was a trip planned into Texas. It was meant to be 2 days, 5 cities. How did this trip all come about, Clint, and why did they go to Texas?
Well, it was actually 3 days. We were going to go to San Antonio, Houston, Fort Worth, Dallas, and then Austin, and then out to the LBJ Ranch. The trip was planned in the spring of 1963 in a meeting down in El Paso, Texas, between President Kennedy, Vice President Johnson, and Governor Connally. In 1960, the election was very, very close. So they knew that in 1964, they had to carry some states in the South. So they picked 2 with the most electoral votes, Florida and Texas, and decided they would campaign in those 2 states. On November 16th, President Kennedy went to Florida. Then he went to Cape Canaveral, Palm Beach, Tampa, and Miami. Then he came back to Washington. Then they planned to leave on Thursday, November 21, for Texas. Mrs. Kennedy was going to go along.
And so that's the reason you went on this trip, is because Mrs. Kennedy was on the trip.
Correct.
So take us through that first morning as you're at the White House. How does the day begin?
Well, the president had an early morning appointment there with 2 ambassadors from the United States to a couple of countries in Africa. That was the only appointment he had before we were going to leave. When he came down from the second floor residence, he passed by my offices, stuck his head in and said, Clint, he said, we're going to take John with us on the helicopter out to Andrews. I said, yes, Mr. President, I'll have the agents alerted. And so that's what we did. We flew out of the White House in a helicopter and flew to Andrews Air Force Base. Mrs. Kennedy, the President, young John were on board. We got to Andrews, and they were about to get off the helicopter and go to board Air Force One, and young John wanted to go along. Well, he couldn't go, so he had to go back to the White House, and he got very upset, and he started to cry. So President and Mrs. Kennedy, trying to console him, they told him that, look, John, we'll be back to celebrate your birthday next Monday, November 25th. That didn't seem to satisfy him. So the president turned to Agent Foster, who was with him, and said, Mr. Foster, will you take care of John while I'm gone? And Mr. Foster said, yes, Mr. President. And so that was the last thing that we heard the president say to in John's presence, that he would be back and that he wanted Agent Foster to look after him until he got back. Then the president boarded Air Force One, and we flew on down to San Antonio, Texas. We arrived down there. There was a large crowd at the airport. Thousands of people had lined the airport, including on top of the terminal, inside the glass terminal. They were everywhere they could be in order to see the President and Mrs. Kennedy. Fortunately, on this particular occasion, the President avoided going into the crowd.
She was very pregnant, and about 2 weeks into the assignment, you got a phone call.
Yes, it was Thanksgiving night, 1960, and I got a phone call. I was at my home, and the phone call told me that they had just taken Mrs. Kennedy to Georgetown Hospital. In an emergency situation, she was about to give birth. So I raced to Georgetown Hospital, paced the floor like an expectant father. The President was in Florida, and I was there and witnessed when John F. Kennedy Jr. was born, and I saw him shortly after birth.
And in the photo there, you can sort of see Clint peering behind, and in a lot of these photos, you have to sort of pick him out because he tries to stay in the shadows. His job is to not be in the photos, but you'll see him as we go along. So even though you were with Mrs. Kennedy, you spent a lot of time with President Kennedy as well, just because you were so close to the family.
Yes, I had a great deal to do with President Kennedy. In this particular photo, we were in Florida, and I had been advised that the President's brother-in-law, Prince Radziwill, and his best friend, Chuck Spaulding, were going on a little walk. And periodically, the President and Mrs. Kennedy were going out to check on him. And they knew that the Secret Service was going to have to go out there or be there. So they volunteered me.
And how long was this little walk?
50 miles. And so I put on my only shoes I had that would last that long. They were wingtip dress Florsheim's. And I picked up the Prince and Mr. Spaulding, and we went out to the Sunshine Parkway and started walking toward Fort Lauderdale.
And so what's this a photo that we see here?
The President came out. The Prince and Chuck are resting. The President is admonishing me because I allowed them to rest. You see, there was a little wager involved. He bet them they couldn't do it, and he wanted to make sure I pushed them hard enough so they couldn't.
And so you were with them all the time.